Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having this great event and also inviting me here. I'm Dan Qing. I'm from Management Department. So today I'm going to share you some of my really earliest research, which I was conducting almost 10 years ago regarding Chinese companies' CSR, and tell you about really at the early stage how CSR was really coming into China and how different companies were reacting to this kind of new trend of CSR. So as we all know that CSR is a very, very popular concept nowadays, but things, however, were a little bit different at the very early stage when CSR was really initially introduced to the Chinese context. So these two papers, the talk was based on two of my earliest papers regarding how the Chinese company CSR was actually largely a politically driven process. So I'm going to illustrate what does that mean and how do various firms really respond to this pressure. So let's begin. So CSR in China. CSR in China, even though now it has been a very popular concept, but it was a little bit strange at the early stage. So we know that China has been evolving from a purely socialist country to now a market-oriented country. So when it was during the socialist stage, everything was provided, especially the welfare was provided by the government. That is housing, your healthcare, education, etc. So the state was taking care of everything from your birth to almost to your death. So that was at the socialist stage. And then we know China introduced the economic reform starting in 1979, and everything started to be marketized. Meaning you need to buy, say, education, you need to pay for your education bills, you need to pay for your housing, you need to pay for the healthcare. So everything was pushed to the market, and the state was relatively retreating from providing social welfare. So the process was going on, and until 2006, then the central government realized that there were series of social and economic and also environmental problems due to the priority the sole priority given to the economic growth. Then the environmental the environmental practice has been very bad, and we have air pollution, and also there is economic inequality, and there are also citizens complaining about everything that was too market-oriented. So that was only until 2006. When the central government started a campaign that was calling for building a harmonious society, and starting to push all the enterprises, not only state-owned enterprises, but also private companies, to take on more responsibilities and to provide more their social responsibilities to citizens by, say, paying attention to the health care, paying attention to employee welfare, environmental protection, etc. So that was a backdrop of the overall process for the early stage of CSR. So here, 2006 was a very important year. So only in 2006, that is the first time the concept of corporate social responsibility was first introduced into the legal system in China. So Chinese corporate law included the corporate social responsibility for the first time in the legal system. However, then the interesting thing came. That was the motivation of my two studies. That is, if you ask domestic companies, especially those small and medium-sized companies, back to 2006, when you ask them, what do you understand corporate social responsibility? What do you do if the government asks you to do CSR? So that question, when you throw this question to those small and medium-sized domestic companies in China, many companies didn't know exactly what do they mean. So they lack of knowledge, and they also lack of any access or support to CSR activities. So here, I would like to ask you, the audience, a question, just a simple guess. So in 2006, there was a survey conducted to medium and small-sized companies in China by IFO. They were asking those business owners, give me 3 top activities that you consider as CSR. Top 3 in 2006. Can you guess which number 1 named by all the small and medium companies' owners. In their view, they regard it as CSR. What's the top one? Have a guess. The top one activity back in 2006 that those small companies in China regarded as CSR. Donation, only we can guess donation? No, not too close. And that's too advanced. Not even close. Donation is closer. Donation actually was ranked number 3. So what's the number 1 and number 2 activities that were considered as CSR in 2006? Tax? What tax?
Well, tax on maybe, I don't know, maybe revenue?
That was a good guess. Any other thoughts? Tax, donation. Other things that back then the Chinese companies thought that was regarded as CSR. David? Not laying off workers. Yeah, that's close. Paying salaries, that's a little bit too advanced, similar to the employee welfare. Okay, so the number one, so donation, as mentioned, was number 3. So number 3 activities that has been regarded as CSR in 2006, regarded by most Chinese small and medium-sized companies. Number 2, related to not laying workers. Number 2 is helping the government maintain social stability. So that was regarded by Chinese companies as CSR activities. So what was number 1? Number 1 was paying the right amount of corporate taxes. So that was number 1. So now, if we consider this, we can say, oh my God, only the donation is closely enough can be regarded as a CSR, right? But back then, the Chinese companies thinking, if I paying the right amount of tax, I'm not doing any tax evasion, or tax avoidance. I'm already doing my CSR. I'm already doing my social responsibility to the society and to the government. And then number 2 is I will help the government maintain social stability by not laying off workers, by not creating any social crisis like that. So you can imagine, starting from this kind of very low stage, Chinese companies really lack of the right knowledge of doing CSR, and really also do not have any help or infrastructures to do the right CSR activities. So this is overall the backdrop of my 2 studies regarding how, given this background, given all this lack of knowledge and less of access to infrastructures, how do Chinese companies really respond to the political pressure given by the government when the government really want to push the Chinese companies to do more CSR activities. So this is the first paper that was published in 2019, but I conducted this research actually was as early as 2008. So that was only 2 years after 2006. So this study, we employ a survey data, and that was the first survey data regarding Chinese CSR activities. So that was a national representative survey data of Chinese companies in 12 cities. So the study was funded by the IFC and conducted together by the National Statistics Bureau in 2006. So immediately after the Chinese corporate law included CSR in the legal terms. So the survey asked more than 1,000 companies and regarding their CSR activities and their founders' characteristics and the firm's characteristics. So in this study, what we are interested in is, given that certain companies may bear more political pressures from the government, how do they really respond? What kind of CSR activities are they doing, given the lack of knowledge and access? So we had a theory, and then we have empirical support. So the theory is we find that when those companies that they are endorsed by the government, they inherently face stronger political pressure, because for those companies that they are endorsed by the government, such as when they are serving in the political council, serving as the national delegates to the political conference, and also the national conferences, or they have winning the government awards, they naturally face a stronger expectation from the government to engage in more socially responsible behaviors. So for those endorsed companies, we argue that they actually, given that they don't know what CSR is really about, and they understand this through a political sense or a political angle, then they will naturally, given they are also rational actors, they will selectively engage in CSR activities that will, on the one hand, will impose less cost, and also on the other hand, will impose less interference into their internal activities. So we argue that by doing that, by having this kind of intention in mind, they will do things selectively. On the one hand, they will engage in more donations, which, because you can imagine, donation is normally just a one-time thing. So, and it is visible, and it imposes less strength, less discretion constraint on firms' internal operations. So they just do donation not at once and not interfering any into their internal operations. But on the other hand, they will also, at the same time, doing less in environmental protection activities. Because doing environmental protection activities, you can imagine, those will require they would change the operation processes and also upgrade the equipment, etc. That will inherently impose a huge costs, and also sometimes will require them to reshape the overall internal operation. So given that they are rational and they don't know what's really CSR about, they chose to do donation in order to satisfy the government's demand, but are really not focusing more on the internal operationalization, optimization, and also upgrading. So this is the conclusion and the finding from this paper. So we create a measure in order to compare their donation and environmental production amounts by comparing with the median values of the industry mean. So if we argue that if they are dedicating more, meaning they spend much more than the median companies in their industry in donation, but selectively they spend much less than the median company in their industries. So whereas all the other options that we created here are considered not as selective engagement. So indeed, we find the solution. We find the conclusion. That is, firms, if they face really stronger political pressure due to their endorsement from the government, they will do more donation, but on the other hand, they will choose to do less in environmental protection. So that was a conclusion done in this study in around 2006. So the second study is more extensive, and along the process, so we mentioned that in 2006, the Chinese government started to incorporate CSR law, incorporate CSR concept in the accompanying law, and then in 2008, by the end of 2007, the central government issued an even stronger guideline to all the publicly listed companies, require certain companies, such as those listed in the Corporate Governance Index, and also state-owned, state-owned companies to issue CSR report together with their annual report. So that was a guideline, a further guideline, in order to push more companies to pay more attention to CSR, and also to strengthen the link between the financial performance with other social and economic development. So that was, by the end of 2007, a further guideline issued by the central government. So this study is focusing on what kind of companies are more likely to issue CSR report under that guideline, and also what kind of report that they are writing. So here is an interesting thing is, even though this is a guideline, but this guideline is not compulsory. So only those required companies, so those only those listed in the state-owned companies, those are centrally owned companies, and or those are listed in the corporate governance index are required to issue CSR. So those are the required, but only around 300 companies. But the other companies, they are not required. So they had a very strong discretion to choose whether I follow the guideline or not. So this study is paying attention to those companies that are not required by this guideline, whether they follow or not, and what kind of CSR report that they are writing. So we can see through this graph, apparently starting from 2006 and 2007, only a handful of companies were writing CSR report. But after 2008, after the guideline was really issued, you see a huge jump of CSR reporting issued by Chinese publicly listed companies. And also the quality really varies. So what we are doing here is we really try to understand for those companies, again, if they have a stronger political channel linked with the central government, they face a very strong political pressure from the central government. Meanwhile, different from the first study, here we also disentangle the different layers of the government. That is, the central government has the strong push on CSR, whereas at the same time, for all those local governments, they have their own agenda. Say, for example, some are really backward governments, like in my province, Anhui or Guizhou, those are relatively backward provinces. They still have a very strong imperatives in developing economic growth. For those local governments, how do they also perceive the central government's demand in CSR activities? And also more complicatedly is when the companies located in those provinces, how do they really process the conflicting demands from the central government and also the local governments? So those are the central research questions that we are pursuing. So we look at all publicly listed companies on Shenzhen and Shanghai Stock Exchange from 2008 to 2011. So the study was started in 2011. So that was when the point we were able to collect the data for only 3 years. So we look at all the public companies, their annual report or CSR report. And at that time, there was an NGO called Renling. So they started to rate and evaluate the quality of the CSR report. So that was the first time in China has this agency, the external agency, really to evaluate the quality of the CSR report. So that was something really new. So we were able to get the data at that time and to follow their rating to see what kind of reports quality that they are doing. And also, in order to measure the local government's GDP growth orientation, and we coded all the Chinese provincial governments' 11th year 5-year plan. So in China, all the Chinese governments need to stipulate their 5-year plan in advance of those 5 years. So in those 5-year plans, you can see a very clear strategic orientation on what kind of priority that the local government will emphasize in the 5 years down the road. So we code those 5-year plans across all the 31 provinces in China, and we see a huge variances. And those variances are the key part that we're focusing on to disclose what kind of conflicting pressures that those companies are really facing. So the Renling score, I think they are still issuing now. They had more and even richer data nowadays. So the Renling score focusing on the, say, for example, the overall evaluation, whether the CSR report is really written in a good quality with the real content and also with the real technical, say, transparency, disclose enough data, and also whether really readable, etc. So it covers all the 3 different aspects. So the interesting thing is, at that time, I really interviewed, in order to facilitate my own understanding of the phenomenon, I interviewed dozens of publicly listed companies, and I asked them, how do they write about the CSR report? Not surprisingly, again, due to the lack of knowledge and also lack of support, most of the companies say, we really do not have any knowledge, and we just ask the secretary of the CEO or secretary of the chairman to write the report. And from the coding of the CSR reports, you can see there are huge variances on the quality. So if, for example, this one, the first Fuxing company, has a very relatively better CSR report. It has a longer page for as long as 84 pages, and it covers 6 items such as employee welfare, governance, engaging suppliers and customers, environmental supply, gender diversity, etc. All those familiar terms that we now are familiar with. And also the overall ranking score is 76, so which means the quality is really of, the CSR report is really of good quality. In comparison, you see there is another mining company. It has the CSR report as 2 pages and it covers only 3 items. Probably just we donate to certain events and we provide the right amount of tax, or we do certain, we provide some employee welfare, and we pay attention to the security, etc. And not surprisingly, the running CSR report score is very low, and it's almost the bottom 2 bad examples. Of course, all those the reports that are issued by Chinese listed companies. So, what the main argument of this paper is, we see there's a strong conflicting pressure from the central government and the local government. As we all know, starting from 2006, the central government has shifted its attention from pure pursuing economic growth to a relatively balanced approach by building a harmonious society, etc. Whereas the government, the local government, has different orientations across different provinces. So we see some provinces have a very exclusive focus on GDP, whereas some other provinces and cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, or Zhejiang, or Guangdong, they have a very balanced developmental orientation. So we argue that for firms that with linkages with the central government, so say for those centrally owned companies and also for firms that are serving as national delegates in the central governments, they facing this pressure, they need to issue CSR reports very fast, immediately following the guideline issuance, and then they produce very good quality. However, on the other hand, for companies located in provinces where the local governments give really high priority to GDP growth rate, they will reissue CSR reports slowly and also with very lower quality, because for them, they have a stronger connection with the local government, and also the local governments provide all the necessary resources for their economic growth. So when the local governments do not pay much attention to the other factor of the development, those companies, naturally, they will also channel less resources to social aspects. So as a result, they pay less attention to CSR, and they not too much value the importance of CSR, and they issue CSR reports very slowly and also with a bad quality. So the last is the most interesting part, is how the conflicting pressure really play a role. So for those firms, they had linkages with the central government, but located in provinces with high GDP growth orientation. For them, the conflicting pressure really are in place. So we propose that they would have a decoupling strategy. That is, they will issue CSR report very fast, but with lower quality. So they really decouple what they are doing in terms of CSR activities. So taken together, from these 2 papers, we see that at the early stage of the CSR activities in China, all the companies, when they are doing CSR activities, actually that kind of orientation was really pushed by the government. So that was the first word that I was listing on the early slide, that at the early stage, CSR in China was inherently a very political-driven process. I'm sure for nowadays, it was still the case, but other forces are now coming to play a role, like consumer awareness and also the market suppliers' pressures and the customers' pressures, etc. And also the public, especially the growing awareness from the customers and also from the overall public. but at the early stage, that was inherently due to the political pressures. So I do not have much time, and I just want to mention one point. And the point that I was also always highlighting with my students, so that is, given the global awareness, the increased awareness on CSR and ESG activities, in China there was actually a huge opportunities in professionalism and jobs in terms of pursuing a CSR-related professions, because the shortage of CSR specialists and experts in China is still the case. So when more and more companies, they need to adopt a better specialized CSR and ESG programs, they really rely on those professionals on CSR and ESG to help them design a better CSR programs and ESG index and activities, etc. But there are still a large shortage of those experts and professionals. So this is where students like you and the future managers can really design a future around this area. And I'm sure that's a very promising career, both in China, and not only in China, but also in many other countries like China, or those emerging economies. So I think that's all my sharing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danshan. I think we have time for one quick question.
So your Y variable is all the CSR stuff that's been taking place. And your X is the government. So for example, people who are supported by the government do more CSR and so on and so forth. Are you confusing the cause and the effect? Could it be the other way around? That because some companies are doing more CSR and that's why the government is having a link with them?
Sure. So that was actually the very earlier stage. So in sociological studies, I think that was around 1999. So that was a study in sociological discipline. That was exactly the arguments that you were mentioning. That was reverse causality, right? So the two processes are actually going in the same time. But later on, when the government really shifted its orientation and placed more and more emphasis on CSR, more and more companies, they realize that, especially for those have already had the endorsement from the government, has stronger linkages with the government, they realize that they face higher expectations in order to get a further endorsement. So the two, you are absolutely right. The two processes are, in reality, is going at the same time. And empirically, of course, we need to do, for all the further study, when the data and also when the empirical methods are allowed, more identification has been conducted. So we need to take into consideration the endogeneity at the first place. So all the later studies have already considered the selection issue at the first place. Yeah.
Thank you.